Hello everyone, welcome to the updated beginner's guide to warriors slash solo. This is a request by Fear the Hammers, and as usual I think it's important that we start off with how to build them, right? And also just kind of as a heads up, I am actually this is the only series in which I'm going to be starting with Conquest and moving backwards, because it is in Conquest that what I'm going to talk about build-wise is going to make the most sense. So after this particular episode, the follow-up episode on the updated Beginner's Guide to Warriors is going to very specifically be starting with Conquest, going to Slash, and then moving backwards, because it makes more sense from that perspective. You'll see what I mean by the end of it. When I first did the original Beginner's Guide to Warriors, I did Arena to Joust, the usual stuff, what I did for the rest of the classes. However, it became rather difficult to explain building in those other modes without the context of how it works in Conquest, which is kind of where solo laners kind of cut their teeth, so to speak. So let's talk warriors. Right now, in the specific context of the solo lane role, each and every role has its pros and cons, its mountains to climb. For the solo lane, a large part of this is adapting your build to the needs to counter the enemy to some extent, and also to the needs of your team. If your support is doing poorly, then you need to build a bit more defense. If your jungler is doing poorly, then you need to be building a bit more offense, right? Now, the best approach that I have found over the course of my SMITE career has always been your first 3 items you build specifically to whoever you're playing as in the solo lane. And then the last 3 items adjust very aggressively depending on the needs of the situation, right? I'm using Gilgamesh here because Gilgamesh is one of the very few warriors who can build either ability-based or auto-attack based. Fear the Hammers very specifically stated that they had a problem dealing with Guan Yu and Gilgamesh in solo lane. This episode is also going to go to some extent explaining why Gilgamesh is a pain in the ass to deal with as an enemy in solo lane. Part of that reason, actually a large part of that reason, is because he can build either way, and just him building Bluestone Pendant isn't necessarily an indication that he's going ability-based either, because for Gilgamesh, he can build the Corrupted Bluestone and get great additional damage on his abilities, get increased attack speed for his auto attacks, and get increased protections, which is a beautiful thing. In fact, Bluestone is typically what I will build on Gilgamesh regardless of the build I'm going for, whether I go auto attack or ability based, right? Bluestone and Soul Eater are very common builds for me, the first 2 items usually for Gilgamesh, and usually it's my 3rd item that will indicate, okay, I'm going for auto attacks or I'm going for abilities, right? Now, let's veer away from Gilgamesh for a bit here. Alright, let's talk a bit more of a classic warrior. Right, let's actually talk Guan Yu, okay? Now, I've discussed Guan Yu before on the Comprehensive Guide to Guan Yu, just as a reference. And how I build him in the solo lane does vary a little bit from support, right? For Guan Yu, he's ability-based, and you can tell he's ability-based because even though he's got this lovely attack chain, right? He's got an AoE on his 3rd attack, which they actually don't express here, but he's got the ability to reduce his cooldowns by 2 seconds with Conviction, reduces cooldowns by 2 seconds with Warrior's Will. Taolu Assault is an amazing ability, and then we have Cavalry Charge for loads of damage, and just slow, right? Now, for Guan Yu, and for most ability-based warriors, I'm going to actually wander away from Guan Yu, because Guan Yu has all of these items in a row, all of his ducks in a row, so to speak. Let's talk instead about Nike, okay? Now, Nike is also very ability-based. She does have AoE auto attacks, but primarily her damage comes from her abilities. So typically, a lot of people are either going to build Bluestone or they're going to build Warrior's Axe. Now, which one of these two you prefer is going to come down to primarily how defensive you like to play. If you're a more defensive player, then Warrior's Axe is going to be the better pickup. If you're a more aggressive player, then Bluestone Pendant is going to be the better pickup. There are exceptions to this rule. I will discuss those, but for the most part, if you're an ability-based warrior, these are the two major options you're looking at. Now, I have seen some people build the warding sigil. I keep calling this the talisman for some unholy reason. I see some people build warding sigil. I see some people build tainted steel. These generally aren't great ideas. You are rather heavily banking on the hope that your jungler will gank, because both of these options lack sustain. Now, the important thing to note about both Bluestone Pendant and Warrior's Axe is both of these will heal your health and to some extent your mana as well. Warrior's Axe, steals, literally takes 30 health away from the enemy, and gives it to you, right? And each level that's 1.5 more HP, and it just consistently restores 20 mana. Bluestone Pendant increases your HP and MP5, your HP 5 by a little bit more. So obviously both of these are healing you a little bit more than they're restoring your mana, which is why the mana buff is important. But both of these do have a way of helping you sustain for an extended duration of time. One of the key goals of the solo lane is to stay in that lane for as long as humanly possible, okay? The goal of the solo lane is to get as beefy as possible, as quickly as possible, just smoothly waltz into mid lane, and then curb stomp somebody. That's the goal, right? You win your lane, you fart your way over to mid lane, and you kick some people in the face, right? That's the goal of... Well, that's one of solo lane's goals. In the early game, in the laning phase, that is what solo wants to do, okay? To help with staying in lane and farming as much golden experience as possible, Bluestone Pendant and Warrior's Axe are the ways to go. Again, which one you prefer is going to change depending on how defensive you feel like playing. If you're, aggressive, obviously you go Bluestone. If you're defensive, you obviously go Warrior's Axe. Okay? Now, when you're building an ability-based warrior of some variety, a lot of the times you're going to see people go into one of two primary first items. The first one that is very popular for ability-based warriors is very specifically Soul Eater, because they are looking to evolve Soul Eater, and they're looking to be able to heal themselves from their abilities. That is one of the things that is very popular. For good reason. It gives you some really great sustain, it gives you some penetration, it gives you some cooldown, right? You can heal up off of the minions with just regular auto attacks because you get the, 15% physical lifesteal. It's a lovely time. The other option that I see a lot of people go for, and I myself go for, is Gladiator's Shield, because at some point in the near future you're going to be building more protections, so capitalizing on that by giving your abilities extra damage from Gladiator's Shield can be quite impactful. And in fact, this gives you a really nice kind of damage advantage, because not only are you getting some power, but you're also getting some physical protection, you're getting some health, cooldowns, and bonus ability damage. So this is also something that I see a lot of people go for. For Nike very specifically, because her auto attacks are actually still very useful, I tend to build Soul Eater on her for that very specific reason. Also, I tend to go Bluestone Pendant on her, again, for that very specific reason. It's that way when I evolve into Corrupted Bluestone, if I decide to go that direction, sometimes I go Bluestone Brooch, sometimes I go Corrupted Bluestone with Nike, but if I do go Corrupted Bluestone, she's got the auto attacks to really support that as actually being a good idea, right? So I don't usually go into Warrior's Axe with Nike very specifically. Regardless, these are one of your two items. Now, Gladiator's Shield is a bit risky, because out of all of the roles in the game, solo lane is the most likely to have the wilder picks on the enemy team, okay? You're usually going to face off against warriors or assassins. That is most solo lane players, right? Fear the Hammers very specifically talks about how, or specifically mentions in their request, that most of the people they're fighting against are physical, and that is 100% true. In fact, I can narrow it down slightly more. It's specifically assassins and warriors. Very rarely, although it still occasionally happens, very rarely is a hunter brought into the solo lane, and very rarely is anything magic brought into the solo lane, although last year there was quite a very popular Guardian meta in the solo lane, where a lot of people were playing Guardians in the solo lane. So just be aware of the fact that it can get pretty wild and woolly in that lane very quickly, and if you start with Gladiator's Shield on the assumption that, hey, the enemy is likely to be physical, then you might be shooting yourself in the foot a little bit here, because this is only going to then help you against the minions, rather than helping you against both the minions and the enemy god like you were originally anticipating. So my go-to second item tends to be Soul Eater if I'm playing an ability-based warrior, or assassin, right? Because that way, no matter what they are, I can usually turn around and adapt to the particular situation, whatever it happens to be, right? If they wind up being magic, then right after I'm done building Soul Eater, I can start working on some magic protections, right? But typically Gladiator's Shield is usually going to be what you're going to go for anyways at some point, so it doesn't hurt to necessarily build it early if that's the way you're more comfortable playing. Once again, this really comes down to how aggressive you are as a solo laner, right? So we have that. Now, obviously, whichever one of these two you build as your second item, you build the other one third, right? And this is, again, these are items very specific to your choice in the solo lane. But what happens for your last three items? Because right now, hypothetically, we're talking Bluestone Pendant, Soul Eater, and Glad Shield, right? These are our first three items. These are whatever these three items are, these are absolutely the items you're building 100% of the time, every time in lane. The exception possibly of Glad Shield, we might instead go for some form of magic protections, say, for instance, just as a kick, Runic Shield. Pestilence is another good option if the enemy has a lot of healing, right? Regardless, we're looking at one of these two. We're going to assume Glad Shield here, because, again, as Fear the Hammers points out, most enemies in this lane are going to be physical, at least in the current meta. So this is your, sort of like your core, right? This is your baseline, this is what you always go for, or very nearly so, depending on whether or not you need that magic protections. But what about the last three items? Now, this is where two things need to be kept in mind for your build. Now, for the third item, the only thing you really need to adjust is your protections. Are you going magic or physical protections? It's really the only difference. You should have something in mind for either of these options, depending on what the enemy is in lane, right? However, the last three items are going to very specifically adjust based entirely on what your team needs. Now, let's say, for example, your support is doing very poorly, and they aren't doing enough as a front line to protect the team. So if that were the case, then personally, I would go into a bit more defense. I would grab Genji's Guard, I would grab Pridwin, and then I would probably grab, I don't know, I might grab Void Shield if the enemy team is particularly tanky. Maybe I'll grab Mystical Mail to add some extra damage while maintaining my physical protections. Maybe I pull Sovereignty in. Perhaps I use Contagion if the enemy team has a lot of healing, right? Maybe the enemy team has a lot of magic and I've already built Runic Shield, so maybe I want Pestilence, right? Or possibly I'm running Bulwark of Hope, again as an ability-based warrior, or ability-based solo laner, right? I have all of these options. But if your jungler was doing fairly poorly, then maybe I would adjust this a little bit. Maybe I would grab instead Shogun's Kusari for a bit of an attack speed boost. Maybe I might still grab Void Shield, but maybe instead I grab, say, Mystical Mail, right? And maybe I'll grab, the Sledge, right? To splash in a little bit more damage alongside protections rather than just going full protections like I might if the support was doing poorly, right? So that's what the last three items are really about. It's all about adjusting to what your team needs. You got to look at your jungler, you have to look at your support and say, hey, are these two doing well or are they doing poorly? And then you have to kind of make your decision from there. So that's primarily where, and a lot of this is going to be protections. I mentioned Shogun's Kusari here. That's not necessarily something I build on ability-based solo laners a lot. My typical go-to magic protections tend to be one of two items. I tend to either go Pestilence if the enemy team has a lot of healing, or I'll go Bulwark of Hope, because that health shield is very difficult to punch through, right? A lot of the times it's Bulwark of Hope, but, you know, we've got all of these other options. And by other options, what I'm talking about is, you know, you've got actually several different magic protection items. Now, I personally use Bulwark of Hope because combining this passive shield with all the protections you typically have, again, makes this very difficult to punch through from an enemy's perspective and can save your life in quite a few situations. And of course, Pestilence for anti-healing, but if you want some cooldown, you can very easily go into Genji's Guard, or if you prefer the damage mitigation from Oni Hunter's Garb, you can absolutely go into this as well. Typically, though, I only really go into this tree when it's my third item. Right, I say Runic Shield here, this is a very popular item, but it was simply an example. My personal preference for a third item, if my laning opponent is magic, is going to generally be Genji's Guard or Oni Hunter's Garb, usually Genji's Guard if I'm ability-based, because I do want that cooldown reduction. The reason why is because this provides me with a lot of MP5 and the magic protections I need against my laning opponent. Again, this is conditional to my laning opponent being magic. If they're physical, I'm going Glad Shield, and a lot of the times for my magic protections, I'm instead going Bulwark of Hope or Pestilence, because by that time, I'm not likely to need a whole lot of MP5. Now, some people like to build Manticore's spikes. For me, it depends on the specific warrior / assassin. Some of them are really good with this, some of them not so much. Nike, for instance, is very good with this. I like this on Nike because she triggers it with her jump, and theoretically she triggers it with her push as well. Well, she's theoretically supposed to. It's not terribly consistent. She's supposed, let me put it this way, she's supposed to, but she is very good with Manticore's Spike, but some warriors just aren't very good with Manticore's Spike. For instance, Erlong Shen doesn't really trigger this. I don't think he can trigger this at all, actually. I think possibly his ult does, but that's about it. And even then, because they say hard crowd control, but that's changed. The definition of that has changed, and I think that Manticore Spikes is having a hard time. Even though Manticore Spikes was invented after the change, I think because of the way they coded it, Manticore Spikes sometimes has a bit of a hard time kind of discerning what is and is not hard crowd control. I've noticed some abilities that deal hard crowd control sometimes don't give you the spike, sometimes they do. Either way, regardless, but some people are really fond of this. Again, it is going to depend on what specific warrior you are or solo laner you are. Tends to have a substantial difference there, but this is a nice dual protection item, and on those people that I really do like building that on, it is a very popular fourth item for me, if, again, the warrior in question can really use this, because this gives me a nice combination of protections and a damage output source, right? So regardless of how well my support or my jungler are doing, this can kind of fulfill those conditions either way. Give me a little bit of both. And some MP5 to boot. Now, you know, there's that particular choice there. For physical protections, if I feel I need more of these, again, depending on the situation, sometimes I'll go Breastplate of Valor, although again, I prefer the dual. I prefer Pridwin in a lot of situations when I need cooldown. We'll get back to that in a second. For physical protections, Contagion if they have healing, and I'm building something else as my magic protections, maybe I really want Bulwark of Hope, because the enemy team is a high damage composition, so I want that health shield, and therefore I can't build Pestilence, but they have a lot of self-healing, so I still need some form of anti-heal. I'll go into Contagion, right? And besides that, there's not really a whole lot of other physical protection items I'll build for an ability-based solo laner. Sometimes I'll build Void Shield if the enemy team is really tanky and I have enough other physical members of my team. Again, occasionally I'll build Shifter's Shield if the enemy team is, again, particularly tanky and I need a little bit of extra power to punch through. That is also an option. Sometimes, again, depending on the particular warrior in question, I'll build Mystical Mail. Let me put it this way, right? I've been talking about Nike. Let's go back to Guan Yu because I've got a nice established build here. He's ability-based, right? So when I'm in the solo lane with Guan Yu, typically, I build him a little differently because he self-heals, and he's not the only one that can do this. This tends to also apply to Horus as well. So I usually will start with Bluestone Pendant. I'm also very fond of Warrior's Axe. It really depends on how aggressive I'm feeling. Take your pick there. However, my usual opening move is going to be Gladiator's Shield. Now, the reason why I go Glad Shield first on Guan Yu is specifically because of Taolu Assault, right? That increases both of his protections by 30, giving me a fairly substantial protection boost compared to the enemy. Furthermore, if I happen to have my stacks of Fearless, my passive going on here, then I actually also steal away the enemy's physical protections. So that's a 60 protection swing going on here. Regardless, Gladiator's Shield is still really great for Guan Yu because Guan Yu wants minion poke, okay? Guan Yu really wants that minion aggro because each minion hit triggers Painless, which means you're going to build up these 20 Painless stacks to steal away those protections even more rapidly, right? Well, technically he steals protections either way, but he steals more if he's under the effects of Fearless, and that, of course, obviously is more impactful, right? So he really wants minion poke. He wants to be taking that damage from minions, and Gladiator's Shield is really going to help you with that, regardless of whether or not the enemy is magic or physical. So I always go Gladiator's Shield on Guan Yu as my first item. Every single time. Just to better handle that minion damage, because, again, I am looking for it. My third item, so usually I'll go Warrior's Axe. Actually, let's temporarily clear this, I just don't save it, right? So I'll typically go Warrior's Axe, I'll go Glad Shield. Now, in most situations at this point, I will build... What I build next depends on my laning opponent. Because I've built a Gladiator's Shield, and because Guan Yu does have a self-heal, albeit a weak self-heal, but nevertheless a self-heal, I don't build Soul Eater on Guan Yu. He's one of the very few warriors I don't build this on. I'll talk about some other warriors who have a better example of a more classic solo lane build, but Warrior's Axe, Glad Shield, a lot of the times I'm going to go into more physical protections. A lot of the times this is going to be Mystical Mail. Now, I've gone on record before and stated that I don't like Mystical Mail when I'm playing a solo lane because it forces me to give up my ability to control the minion aggro. But as Guan Yu, I always want that minion aggro. So Mystical Mail actually becomes really useful against a physical opponent. If I'm against a magic opponent, I don't want to stack up this much physical protections, obviously, so I don't build Mystical Mail third if I'm against a magic opponent. If I'm against a magic opponent, I will typically go into either Genji's Guard if I don't need anti-healing, or that will be Pestilence if I do, right? Oops. And one of these three items are what I always... These are my three options. So my first two items, constant. I don't care who my laning opponent is. Warrior's Axe, Glad Shield. Sometimes, if I'm feeling aggressive, I'll throw in Bluestone, obviously, but either Warrior's Axe or Bluestone Pendant and Glad Shield. Very aggressive. I play very aggressively with Guan Yu. He wants to be aggressive, right? My third item, typically Mystical Mail against a physical opponent. If I'm against a magic opponent, that's going to change on whether or not I'm needing anti-heal or not. Now you might be wondering, Professor, what if you need anti-healing and your opponent is physical? Why don't you build anti-healing there, right? Excellent question. If I'm against a physical opponent as Guan Yu, and I'm already building Gladiator's Shield, then very likely, unless they're one of the very few solo laners that can interrupt Taolu Assault, I'm ahead, right? That's the real crux of, Guan Yu. And to answer Fear of Hammer's question of how to deal with Guan Yu, the best answer I can give you is there are two things you can do against Guan Yu to really help you fight Guan Yu in lane. The first is to interrupt Taolu Assault. Now, depending on what your cooldowns look like for your stun or silence, because those are the consistent ways of stopping Guan Yu, it's going to change on how often you can stop Taolu Assault, but most likely, because of the way Guan Yu's kit works, very likely he's going to be using Taolu Assault slightly more often than your stun/silence. But that's the first way you deal with him. If you can stop him from using Taolu Assault, you have a huge advantage, because beyond his dash, he's got no other serious way of doing damage to you besides his ult, which he may or may not want to be using on you in a moment of desperation. But Taolu Assault is his primary offense, and also his primary way of staying alive, because it is boosting his protections. So if you can stop Taolu Assault, you're in a really good position. The second thing you can do to help fight against Guan Yu is do not let him poke you, which sounds really simple, but it is a very difficult thing to accomplish, because Taolu Assault has impressive reach, and of course he's got that short little dash there, and if he's really desperate to poke you for minion aggro, then he'll use his ult, right? This is a very difficult thing to do, even as simple as it sounds. But those are the two things you can really do to help fight against Guan Yu. But from Guan Yu's perspective, if, I'm building Warrior's Axe, I'm building or even Bluestone Pendant for Pete's sakes, and I'm building Gladiator's Shield, and you're physical, you're my laning opponent and you're physical, you're probably screwed. There's just no two ways about it. Guan Yu's early game is insanely strong. So I'm not going to need anti-heal as my third item if you're physical, because I've already built some physical protections, and just doubling down on that with Mystical Mail, you're going to take magic damage, which you're probably not building protections for yet, and I'm going to be reducing your magic protections with my Taolu Assault, so you're going to take a little bit more than you're expecting from Mystical Mail. And honestly, at that point, not only am I very likely ahead, but I don't need anti-healing to beat you down at that point, right? It's just the unpleasant truth about Guan Yu. Now, my fourth item, my fourth item by this time is typically going to be Pridwin. Now, usually my fourth item is going to be a dual protection item for most solo laners. I recommend you build a dual protection item for most solo laners. The only times I really build magic protections exclusively as my fourth item is if the enemy jungler happens to be magic. Ao Kuang is a common example. Or the enemy mid laner comes over and ganks me an abnormal amount of times, or my mid laner is doing so poorly that I'm expecting a gank in the near future, right? One of the two. That doesn't happen very often. My usual go-to is a dual protection item. If I need magic protections for my fourth item, I'm usually going Pestilence if I need the anti-heal, or Genji's Guard if I don't, right? But a lot of the times I'm just going Pridwin. It's a lovely time. Then we'll build my magic protections at this point. Now, whether or not I go Genji's Guard or I go Bulwark of Hope, again, that's going to really primarily matter based on, here's, the situation considering the enemy's damage output. Bulwark of Hope is something I commonly build. I say Genji's Guard here because I want the MP5. Typically also an option here, but you can also use it as an option here as well, right? But I really like Bulwark of Hope at this particular point. Again, the health shield from Bulwark of Hope is stretched even further by the fact that you're boosting your own protections with Guan Yu, right? Fantastic item on him. My last item, that's going to change based on the situation, right? Now, up until now, you've probably noticed that I haven't adjusted for if the jungler is doing poorly, if, the support is doing poorly, right? That is because of how Guan Yu works. Again, Taolu Assault is incredibly potent, reducing enemies' protections and allowing my damage-based items to do more damage. Gladiator's Shield is hitting harder, Warrior's Axe is hitting harder, Bluestone Pendant, if I've built that, is hitting harder, Mystical Mail is hitting harder, Pridwin is hitting harder. All of these items, with the exception of Bulwark of Hope, are a strange combination of defensive and offensive. So up until Bulwark of Hope, it's never really mattered. But the last item is going to change depending, at least for when I play Guan Yu, the last item is going to change when I'm playing solo lane Guan Yu based on what I need. Now, sometimes this is Heartseeker if the enemy team is particularly tanky and my solo laner has been doing bad, right? Not my solo laner, my assassin. If my assassin's been doing poorly, if my jungler's been doing poorly, Heartseeker, or maybe even Hydro Cement, also a very good option here. Both of these can be very good against the enemy team comp. I typically use Hydro Cement against squishy comps. I typically use Heartseeker against aggressive comps, right? If the jungler is doing poorly, if the support is doing poorly, then I will typically go into Caduceus Shield if my allies heal, or if they don't heal, then I'll build some form of protections, some form of additional protections, depending on the context. A lot of the times this is the Sledge. Sometimes I'll just build Caduceus Shield anyways. Maybe I throw in a Mantle of Discord if my support has been doing bad, right? It really depends. But Caduceus Shield or typically one of the cloaks is one of my go-tos. If they're both doing pretty well, then I'm just going to build probably the Sledge. Maybe I build Caduceus Shield. Something that gives me a little bit of power and protections, typically. Right? That's how I approach Guan Yu. Right? Now let's take a look at a different example. Let's talk who's really ability-based. Let's talk Sun Wukong. Right? Cleared this out because as it was actually a test run, the test was horrific. We're looking at a lot of the same things again here. Bluestone Warrior's Axe, he's again also ability based, but he plays really well with Soul Eater. And again, Soul Eater is my go-to second item because regardless of who my laning opponent is, that's going to offer me great value against that target, whoever it is. Now, if my laning opponent is physical, I obviously go Glad Shield. If my laning opponent is magical, I will, again, obviously go Genji's Guard, right? There we have it. Or Contagion/Pestilence if there's a need for anti-heal and I'm behind. Then we build my dual protection item, and I typically run Pridwin. Now, I know that Sun Wukong can bust out Manticore spikes. However, sometimes I just want a Bird of Nope somewhere. Sometimes I even Bird of Nope into a fight. And I just don't find that I trigger Manticore spikes often enough with Sun Wukong for me personally, to justify that purchase. Maybe you're a much more aggressive Sun Wukong than I am, but personally I just don't really pick up Manticore spike that often. It's just not something I use on Sun Wukong terribly often. I usually go Pridwin primarily for the cooldowns, and that really great, delightful passive, which, by the way, incidentally, your passive protection boost, for reference, let me just show you really quick, Undefeated Body, you get plus 10 protections, plus 1 for your level, so it winds up being 30 of each protection when you're under 50% health, right? That affects Pridwin. That affects Gladiator's Shield. It's a wonderful thing. I love Glad Shield and Pridwin on him for that reason. And in fact, the fact that you also get physical power at the same point and the same time also makes Soul Eater very effective as well for very similar reasons, right? And even with I typically use Bluestone Pendant on him. Sometimes it's Warrior's Axe. Warrior's Axe is also really amazing on him. Again, down to your personal preference. These are all really great items, so we're going to go on ahead with the standard assumption here, physical opponent, that's what they usually are. I get Pridwin, now I'm going to be going into magic protections. Again, for later magic protections, I typically go into Bulwark of Hope. Again, we're talking about Sun Wukong having boosted protections under 50% health. Your Undefeated Body is definitely triggered by the time Bulwark of Hope activates, so you're getting that health shield on top of the bonus protections. It's, once again, a really lovely time. Right? Everyone loves it. Now, once again, you'll notice I very carefully have built up items that give me a combination of protections and damage output, with the exception of Soul Eater. So I have one pure damage item and one pure defense item. I have Soul Eater as pure damage, and I've got Bulwark of Hope as pure defense. Warrior's Axe, Glad Shield, and Pridwin all do a combination of increased damage and increased protections. Again, this last item for Sun Wukong is going to change based on how well my support and my jungler are doing. I generally run very similar things, with one interesting exception. You'll notice I haven't really extensively talked about anti-healing with Sun Wukong here. I haven't talked about Pestilence or Contagion too much. Sometimes I'll build it early on if my laning opponent heals a lot. Maybe they're a Chang'e, for example. That definitely calls for Pestilence. But a lot of the times their self-heal isn't so egregiously strong that I want that kind of anti-heal. So for Sun Wukong, if I do need anti-heal and my jungler has been doing poorly, then I'll bust out actually Brawler's Beatstick. Now I don't bust this out for Guan Yu because his heal obviously can't trigger this, and as low as his cooldowns tend to be due to the fact that he can reduce his own cooldowns, it still isn't quite often enough that I necessarily want Brawler's Beatstick on Guan Yu, but I'm very comfortable building this on Sun Wukong. Okay? And again, if I need more protections of some kind, I will typically go for additional protections as needed. If I need more physical protections, my usual go-to is going to be Void Shield or Shifter's Shield. It depends on if the enemy team is tanky or not. If I need more magic protections, my usual go-to is typically going to be Runic Shield a lot of the time. I almost said Anslee, but that's not correct. Runic Shield a lot of the time if I need more magic protections is a popular thing for me. I will also sometimes go Oni Hunter's Garb if the enemy team is particularly aggressive. So if the enemy team is high damage, Oni Hunter's Garb. If the enemy team is high protections or high defense, I'll go Runic Shield. Again, this is only if my support is doing badly. It really depends. As a reminder, if the jungler is doing badly, build damage. If the support is doing badly, build defense. You gotta cover that weakness in the team composition, right? But those are the typical things I'll build. Again, if the enemy team is particularly tanky and I want to throw in, my jungler is doing poorly, Heartseeker a lot of the times, right? If the enemy team is squishy and my jungler is doing poorly, I'll actually build the Crusher, which I find a little bit more effective against squishier comps. And those are the typical items that I will build out against those in those particular contexts. And then let's say, for example, let's pull one more ability-based example, right? Let's pull someone who doesn't self-heal. Oh, heck, let's go King Arthur. Now, King Arthur, I typically go with Bluestone Pendant on a lot of the times, sometimes Warrior's Axe. Again, we're still talking about Soul Eater. We're still commonly building Gladiator's Shield, or alternatively, we are building Genji's Guard. We do... And now, the interesting thing about King Arthur is, again, in theory, he does have a couple of ways of activating Manticore's Spike. He's got a pop-up, he's got his ult, of course, things like that. I still don't see it trigger consistently often enough that I go in that direction. Maybe it's a glitch, maybe it's Maybelline, I don't know. I still don't build it that often. I still typically am going for Pridwin for that cooldowns a lot of the time. It's just a personal preference of mine at this point. It's really tough to beat Pridwin in terms of cooldowns and protections. And of course, that passive can inflict some damage when need be. Now, at this particular point in time, however, I'm really fond... There's a couple of options. Now, I've mentioned Genji's Guard, right, and I've mentioned Pridwin, but I'm also really fond of slightly different options with King Arthur. And I've been experimenting with this recently, and I've found it very successful. Oni Hunter's Garb, and I find Spirit Robe to be very effective. Now, both of these provide you with damage mitigation, and just so that way you're aware, the fuller your sword is, which sounds weird, you get more damage mitigation, right? You get up to 4% damage mitigation which isn't a lot, to be honest, but combine that with the 3% for each of these, that's 9% from Oni Hunter's Garb in an ideal scenario, plus the 4% from your passive, that rounds up to that doesn't round up, that adds up to a really nice 13%, and then you get an additional good old 15% whenever you're hit by hard CC every 15 seconds, so it really can help out, and I am very fond of these. I'm becoming very fond of these over my, what I call, standard ability-based warrior build. At least for King Arthur. Again, this is because of his passive giving him damage mitigation, and all this damage mitigation just nicely stacking with each other. At this particular point, though, you know, if I don't build Oni Hunter's Garb as my third, I'm building it fourth recently. You know, we've got all of these absolutely lovely things, and again, very similar scenario to Sun Wukong, right? Where if my jungler is doing poorly, I'm throwing in some ability damage. A lot of the times it's Heartseeker for me. If it's not Heartseeker, it's typically going to be, once again, the Crusher. If I need anti-healing, it'll be Brawler's Beatstick, right? Or if I need protections, it'll of course be, you know, they're tanky, it'll be Void Shield. A lot of the same things happen here. I just make basically a swap out of Spirit Robe in favor I go for Spirit Robe in favor of Pridwin, and Oni Hunter's Garb in favor of Genji's Guard or Boulder of Hope, specifically for King Arthur, right? Now let's talk about auto-attacking solo laners really quick. And I'm going to use Erlang Shen as kind of the premier example of this. Now, Erlang Shen, that was a test build. Erlang Shen has two really interesting options. Most auto-attackers in the solo lane do. Now, I'm about to cause an eyebrow raise from long time solo laners who might really like auto-attacking solo laners. I don't often build Animosity. In fact, the only times I'll build Animosity on an auto-attacking solo laner that is physical, it's not a Guardian solo laner, it's not a Magic solo laner, it's a physical solo laner. Only time I build Animosity is very specifically if we have four or more physical damage members on the team, because we need that magic damage, right? Only time. If we have a standard comp of even just 3 physicals, I am in fact actually going Death's Toll into Death's Embrace. Why is this? There are a number of reasons. First off, compare Benevolence to Death's Toll really quick, right? Benevolence, 10 MP5, 10 HP5. A passive that heals the nearest ally and yourself if you're both in the area and damaged, and gives you gold. Sounds great on paper, but you are solo lane. The only time you're going to be able to foist this health and gold off on someone else is should your jungler gank you, which is by itself a random proposition. Compared to Death's Toll, which gives you 15 increased power, it gives you 75 health, it gives you the ability to restore additional health and mana with every auto attack. In the early game and in the late game, Death's Toll is going to be better because Death's Embrace winds up being 2% of your health and mana and 65 physical power, right? Let's talk about Animosity here, right? We've got the 65 physical power. Oops. So that is, because physical power goes 100% into your auto attack damage, that is a straight up 65 damage increase in your auto attacks compared to Animosity, right? We have Animosity, now we're doing bonus damage based on 3%, and you're not going to show it to me. I'm double checking the percent here. I'm pretty sure it's 3%, right? 3% of your max health, right? So Animosity at baseline, and again, you might have more HP, max HP than this because of the way you've built, but baseline, we are talking. I'm gonna even do it the favor, right? We're gonna go ahead and throw Animosity on because obviously you would have that. I'm gonna do it the favor and say 3,000 HP, just as an approximation, and you are doing a bonus 90 damage, right? Now that sounds great. You're thinking to yourself, gee, that's 25 more damage per auto attack. That's 90 damage baseline. That does not include the enemy's magic protections. Now, the problem here is that Erlang Shen, as a warrior, has no way of reducing enemy magic protections. Most warriors don't. Guan Yu is one of the few, which is why Mystical Mail is so powerful on him. He can actually cause that to do a little bit of extra damage. He can push a couple of extra points of damage out of that pretty consistently. And that adds up. Erlang Shen does not have that, and neither do any of the other auto-attacking warriors or even assassins, right? So that is 90 baseline. It actually winds up being less than that due to enemies' protections. Let me run through a hypothetical scenario here where I do a comparison really quick before we talk about how I build Erlang Shen really. So you get Benevolence, right? Kill this, Benevolence. Then you're going to get your auto attack item. What you start with is going to vary quite wildly. Let's say you build for kicks. Sovereignty. Which recently has been a very popular pickup in that lane. And then you want to build your dual protection item. Lovely, magical. Let's say Caduceus Shield. Then you build your magic protection item. Absolutely Shogun's Kusari. That's not even a question. Let's be really sincere about this. Great. Then you're going to go right on ahead and build probably a second physical protection item. Let's say Berserker's Shield at this point, right? That's a lovely time. Doesn't give you any increased health like the other items, but that's okay. And then, of course, you have to build your last item. This could be something like Toxic Blade if you need anti-healing. This might be Contagion or Pestilence if you need anti-healing. It could be something along the lines of Manticore's Eye, pardon me. Had a yawn there. Manticore's Eye, maybe it's Frostbound Hammer, whatever, right? At the end of the day, you're doing between 90 and 95 damage with this kind of thing. I propose instead we have a completely different conversation. I propose instead that you start with Death's Toll, which is going to do you more good in the beginning. You still can build Sovereignty if you prefer the higher protections of that. I typically go right into Berserker's Shield, and I will typically start with Berserker's Shield even against a magic opponent, or a potential magic opponent, because the passive is going to give me 7% damage mitigation, which still helps against magic damage as well. And again, as an auto-attacker, it's pretty likely that I'm going to be looking to either intentionally or accidentally pull enemy minion aggro to myself. Erlang Shen, for instance, has one auto attack that is an AoE, so it's pretty easy to do this by accident. So I still want those physical protections, and then my very next item is going to be some form of dual protection item. What this is very specifically is going to depend somewhat on the situation. I'm rather fond of Caduceus Shield if other members of my team heal, or I will go with the Sledge, which is a really nice balance of both protections with enemies in the nearby area. It's rather nice, right? And then I'll go for Shogun's Kusari as my fourth. In most situations, typically the enemy is physical, so we'll typically bust out some additional physical. If the enemy team is squishier, I'll go Stone Cutting. If the enemy team is tankier, I'll go Void Shield. In this particular instance, let's assume Stone Cutting Sword. Let's assume they're, 3 squishy people and 2, tankier people, so Stone Cutting Sword does a lot of great work there. And then we finish off with an absolutely delightful Chin Size. Right? Now, I prefer Chin Size because, unlike Animosity, which is giving you 90 damage just outright, 90-ish, outright, before protections are, factored in, Chin Size offers you this really solid 40 increased power right off the top, which means, in other words, that it's just as, before even factoring in the passive, it's giving you almost half of that which animosity is giving you, plus you're reducing the enemy protections pretty actively using either stone cutting sword or void shield. Usually it's stone cutting sword. So not only is that going to stretch a little bit farther because you're reducing their protections, but you also have a 3% of the target's max health with each auto attack, right? So rather than being 3% of your health being added onto your attacks, it's 3% of their health. Now some people aren't going to have as much maximum health as you, but still 3% of their max health in addition to the 40 that it already has generally tends to go a lot farther. So my final item on Erlang Shen, and in fact on most of my auto-attacking solo lane plays, Chin size is last, because it just does more damage than Benevolence and Animosity do at this time, right? So that's generally where I go with this a lot of the time. Again, Benevolence is a very slow starter item and can really cripple your early game, and I kind of urge you to not go for that unless you absolutely have no choice, right? But that's generally how I approach most of my auto attackers. There are, like I said, a couple of variations for some of these. But really quick before I end the episode really quickly, because I'll be getting into more in-depth detail on this in the actual episodes, the reason why Gilgamesh is such a problem to deal with is because he can well, first off, he gets a free item with the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is very much a problem, but he can literally build either full attack speed or full ability-based damage, or some hybrid of the two, and be totally fine. His kit just does all kinds of damage, right? And that's the problem with Gilgamesh. Until he builds his third item, you don't know, should I build maybe Witchblade? Should I be building, I don't know, more protections? Like, how do I react to this? Now, what I'm going to do to kind of better exemplify this for this beginner's guide, and to also kind of in future answer Fear the Hammer's specific questions on this, I am going to go through a couple of Conquest matches using Guan Yu and also Gilgamesh and talking about what they don't want to see so we can better understand how to fight them. But for Gilgamesh, it's more of a matter of figuring out whether he's going ability or attack speed based and then adapting your protections from there. For Guan Yu, it's a matter of stopping his Taolu assault and not letting him poke you, right? That's basically how these two go down. So, that's kind of the overview of the building, how I approach building for both varieties of solo laner, at least the physical ones. We're going to, next episode, I'm going to hop into a match as Guan Yu, and we're going to talk about, Guan Yu's perspective here. Guan Yu also happens to be an ability-based warrior, so we also get to talk about ability-based builds here, right? So with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.